Iconoclasts. This was a game that I wasn't super familiar with. I think I heard about it once before, but what I really know about this game is actually the previous game made by the person who made this game, a game called Noi 2 Love 2 Devolution. It was a very action-heavy, mouse-based PC game that I enjoyed so much that I actually gave it a shout out on my Game of the Year list, like back in 2014 or so, if I recall. It's been a while. But I remember that game being very, very good, and I can see bits of that game's DNA in here, but Iconoclasts is definitely its own unique thing, and I'm not sure it necessarily works. I'm not going to mince words here. I really struggled to get through this game. I thought about giving up several times, and I'm still not actually done yet. I'm about 70-80% the way through the game, but this one was very hard for me. The story follows Robin. Her father, an engineer, has recently deceased, and she, being the good-natured person she is, has taken up his wrench and has started helping people in their daily lives. Unfortunately, said wrench is kind of a banned item in the eyes of the paramilitaristic, overzealous religious cult that kind of governs the world. So, for all intents and purposes, she's kind of a vigilante of sorts. And the very religious town she's in doesn't necessarily appreciate that as much as they could. And so that leads her to some trouble, and she eventually ends up building relationships with all sorts of characters, exploring this world, and understanding how the world ticks. Learning more about the people around her and how things really work in this world. And I think story-wise, the story itself is very, very good, and there's some great twists and turns in there. I gotta tell you, I do like where the story goes, and there were some moments where it almost sort of came to a realization to me what was going on. But a lot of that is done really expertly through background storytelling, through the characters, and actual just environmental designs. Like I said, there was like one thing that really hit me as to what was going on. I was looking at the environment, I like read a little bit of a note in the background, and then suddenly like the context for the whole area just sort of hit me instantly. And it was really quite amazing when that moment hit. But I think the real focus, story-wise, in Iconoclasts is not necessarily the story of Robin's adventure per se, or this world's history, or any of that. But it's more a focus on interpersonal relationships with people. Because every friend and party member that ends up joining, you learn more about them, and really I feel like the story follows these characters, and it's more about the characters than the adventure they're on. And I honestly think above all else, that's what really attracted me to the story. It's really well done, and I like these characters. I think they're believable, real people. I think they were very expertly done. They are hardly paragons of morality. Constantly there's clashing of ideals and virtues and flaws. A lot of these characters are kind of flawed, miserable people, and you see them try and get on with their lives and deal with their issues as best they can, and it's that flawed nature of all these characters that really makes them feel real to me. It doesn't hurt that the world they're in is incredibly interesting, and there's tons of really cool mechanical stuff and background details all over the place. It's really cool to learn more about this sort of religious cult that governs the world. And, it's really cool to see a lot more about the background details and information that sort of lead to the events of the game. I think story-wise this game is excellent. Definitely the characters are at the forefront of this, but it's all very, very well done. Now the gameplay to Iconoclasts is really where I struggle with this game, because as I mentioned at the start, you can kind of see a lot of the DNA of the previous game in here. It was a high-paced action game, and this game very early on feels like a very, very fast-paced, fluid movement-based action platformer. And when it's being that game, it's an absolute blast. Early on you get your wrench, and your wrench can be used to interact with switches, but you can also use it as sort of a grappling hook. And when you use it to just get through an entire environment without stopping, the gameplay feels so smooth and just satisfying to get through. Your very basic gun weapon can be charged up, and you can use the recoil of that charge to almost give yourself like a second jump. Everything very early on points to this being a very movement-focused, and the smooth, incredibly intricate movement seems to be at the forefront of the action, and when it's being that, it's excellent. Then you run into a little bit of background puzzling, and it's an okay thing, but it feels like it's not quite on the same level as the just action platforming and the fluid movement mechanics. And then once you get out of like the immediate early game, you start to realize that this isn't really that game at all. There are moments where the game really wants to be. The bosses are incredibly fast-paced and very, very stressful, but incredibly, very, very action-oriented. But most of the time, this game is more of a slow-paced puzzle platformer. You have to interact with switches using your wrench, you have to interact with buttons, you have to lift boxes to get through environments and move platforms, either to help you navigate a room to get to a power-up or something, or ultimately to defeat an enemy that you otherwise can't take out. Really, combat isn't the main focus here. Aside from the actual bosses themselves, the greater focus is absolutely on this puzzling, and really, I don't think it's necessarily all that good. I ended up halfway through the game almost just flat out quitting because of one stage, which was basically a maze of a single tower divided into a series of single one-way routes that you had to like then backtrack through and try and figure out where you were making small progress otherwhere in different locations. I ended up just getting so frustrated with it because it was just so hard to navigate and awkward. And likewise, this was after hours and hours of having to flip switches to find ways to sort of navigate through environments, as well as just trying to, get the thing that I need to progress. I think the gameplay in Iconoclasts is kind of weirdly diametrically opposed to each other. On one hand, you have the very fluid and nice gameplay that has really, really solid combat. You have the boss fights that oftentimes like to introduce their own mechanics into it, which, on top of everything else, can actually make things very, very sort of stressful and very confusing. We'll talk more about that in a sec, but then you have it contrast against all these puzzles that you kind of have to get through to get to those bits. And it just feels very disjointed in terms of both tone and pace. Most of the game ends up being puzzle solving instead of the action, and then the action just sort of comes out of nowhere. And it's such a change of pace that it really kind of gives you a little bit of like gameplay whiplash there. It might be refreshing to some people who really like puzzling and action, but if you only like one or one more than the other, it's probably gonna leave you feeling very isolated and not really enjoying the game all that much. And like I said, combat likes to introduce its own mechanics, and once you start factoring that into everything, and some of these boss fights also have puzzles in them in order to do them properly, they can get really bloody confusing. Especially when you combine that with the really detailed visuals. I ended up in these boss fights sometimes just completely confused as to what I was supposed to do or what was even happening. I remember there was this one boss very early on that was basically like a giant face, and the room was divided into two halves. You had to swap between two characters, activate some switches, and then attack the face. And between the fact that I had to navigate two different characters, although the character you're not active as is invulnerable, that will change later with a certain boss, which also added a lot of extra stress. I also had to sort of manage like where the platforms were to activate switches to make the boss vulnerable, and I was dodging attacks, and it just got so much that it was just both mechanically and visually just overwhelming. I just had to stop the game at that moment and just sit there and stare at the screen and just try and process what exactly was going on and what was expected of me. And that's happened to me a few times in this game. Not necessarily to the same degree or anything, but sometimes I'll just end up in a boss room and I'll just be like, okay, what am I doing here? What am I looking at? Because it's so visually like vibrant and engaging, but it's so fast paced and there's just so much going on. It ends up demanding so much of you on the spot and just processing new things that just hit you out of nowhere that's never been explained before, and in some cases, even though they say you're gonna need this in the story, you never really see again. Combining that with the very detailed visuals, it just becomes incredibly sensory overload and just completely confusing as to what's even happening and what I'm even looking at. I think that the boss fights were definitely sort of a nod to the previous game. Very high action, very fast paced, but throwing in the puzzles and everything else, it just gets very muddled, and like I said, it feels completely opposed to the puzzle platforming elements of this, which is normally about slower gameplay but more precision, whereas this kind of requires more fast-paced, on-the-fly thinking. It just feels like it requires two different skill sets in order to play both chunks of this game, and it just feels, again, very isolating if you're a fan of one of those things or the other. Like I said, this game kind of feels a little bit diametrically opposed to itself at times. It doesn't know what it wants to be. On one hand, it wants to be a slow-paced puzzle platformer that's focused on precision and solving the puzzles. On the other, it's about dealing with really fast enemies and not taking too much damage or dying. It feels like you just get complete and total whiplash from that. On the puzzly half of this game, there's kind of a weird sort of I couldn't see the forest for the trees sort of thing going on half the time. Like, I was so used to bigger, more complex puzzles that when I ran into a more simple puzzle, I would just get walled by it. Like, here's a great example. I was stuck on this for an embarrassing amount of time. You're in this little area, there's a rock. You have to get rid of the rock. You can't go back to, circumvent it. I tried because I couldn't blow up this rock. I figured I didn't have the right power up or something. So I tried throwing my explosive bombs at it and it wouldn't do anything. I tried charging it up to get a stronger missile to blow it up. That didn't do anything either. I was stuck on this wall for, and I'm ashamed to admit this, about half an hour. And what you needed to do was to fire a missile at that wall, but you had to be standing a certain distance away before it would engage its explosiveness? I don't think that is ever actually used before this in this game, and it will be used after that quite frequently, I've found, especially in moving platforms, but this just kind of comes out of nowhere and doesn't really explain itself terribly well, and I ran into this issue a few times where I could handle these really big complex rooms with relatively little pressure, but when I ran into this simple problem, I would just be stuck on it forever. And then, after an embarrassingly long period of time, I'd realize, oh, there isn't even a puzzle here, it's just one of my more basic moves that I need to deal with this. This game sort of heaps on mechanics and puzzle solutions and tools to the point where you kind of lose track of the most basic stuff and the more rudimentary rules of how this game actually functions. And part of the issue is that a lot of these abilities, even the most basic stuff, kind of gets ignored for periods of time. Part of the great thing about Metroid is that in spite of the fact that you're getting so much stuff, you're constantly using it. No real piece of equipment in Metroid is ever really, for any extended period of time, ignored. So no matter how small an upgrade is, you end up kind of effectively mastering it in the back of your head without even thinking with it because you use it so much. Whereas in this game, some of the more basic stuff just gets ignored, and then, at least for me, I completely forgot that some of this even worked the way it did. It's really weird, and I think that has to do a lot with the way these puzzles were planned out and sort of like the pacing in between them and the requirements for each. You're constantly forced to use the new thing, and you kind of forget some of the older stuff because they're less focused on. This game kind of initially hit me sort of as a Metroid-y style non-linear platformer. There's lots of like hidden areas and secret stuff where you can find loot. I expected to find all sorts of power-ups, and there were a few, but they're actually pretty spread out, and they're pretty much given to you entirely through the plot. And they're entirely used to solve puzzles. All the extra hidden stuff is basically there to give you random sort of minor collectibles, but there is sort of a neat mechanic involving them. If you collect these minor collectibles, you can use them in a crafting system, where if you find various blueprints, you can build minor stat boosts to your character, known as tweaks. You have to sacrifice your craftables to build these tweaks and then go to a save point and apply them, but then they'll modify your gameplay, as the name would imply, slightly. It will tweak your gameplay. It won't change it on a fundamental level or anything. We're talking very, very minor stuff, such as maybe one additional hit before you take damage, or your wrench does just slightly more damage. These are not major game changers, to the point where I honestly kind of just stopped using tweaks after I got a full set of 3, because they just didn't really seem to make any difference from my experience. They were just that minor. There is sort of a cool feature involving them where as you take more damage on your health bar, you'll lose your tweaks until you build them back up by collecting basically energy from killing enemies, and that's a neat feature, but otherwise the tweaks are kind of almost not worth mentioning at all. The overall combat in Iconoclasts is pretty fast-paced and solid. You've got 2 weapons. You've got a stun gun that can be equipped with bombs, and your wrench. Your wrench can be swung. It can also be twirled in place. You can upgrade that to do some other stuff, mostly puzzle-solving stuff, but there's some really neat mechanics in here as well. Depending on what gun you have equipped, either the bomb or the stun shot, you can do different damage to different enemies. Some enemies are only going to take damage from the bombs because, you fired a bomb into their gaping mouth and they took extra damage. And likewise, some enemies can only take damage from the wrench. In fact, there's sort of a very lightly used parry mechanic in here, where if your opponent shoots out little green wrenches as a little bit of a tell, you can parry their attack and reflect it back at them to do damage to them. You can also just straight up Goomba Stomp basically everything and solve all your problems that way, so, combat has options, although it's not super deep, at least until you move into the very quick-paced, very stressful boss fights anyway. I also kind of found it weird that despite the fact that this game has such a focus, at least story-wise, on the characters in this world, and that you're adding friends to your party, and they all have like completely different movesets, you don't really get to play with any of them. You only ever really play as Robin in your party, and while there are smaller bits where you can swap to other characters, usually in very specific situations, boss fights, or very brief moments where you get to just straight up use them, you never really get to explore an expanded profile of abilities for each character. You know, they're very, very rudimentary because you don't spend too much time as any of them, really, and it's not like you can swap between them as Robin, you're just stuck as Robin. And on one hand, I think that's probably a good thing, because given how much issue I was having with the puzzle solving to this game, adding more characters with expanded abilities would probably make the puzzles even more convoluted and probably give me even more of a brain aneurysm trying to solve some of the even most basic stuff. But at the same time, I feel like it's kind of a waste of potential to have all these characters that seem to have their own styles and abilities, and yet not be able to use them in combat or swap to them to just try them out. It just seems like they kind of hang around in your party in the background, and you know, there's a little thing in the corner that tells you they're in your party, but you never really see them do anything for you in combat. I feel like it's a wasted potential that you can't really do anything with these characters in terms of gameplay. Overall, I think the gameplay to Iconoclasts is decent if taken in sort of isolated bubbles. The action is good, the movement is good, and it's fast-paced and a lot of fun. The combat is varied, and there's multiple ways to take out enemies, and some enemies require specific strategies, which makes every encounter somewhat different. The puzzles are interesting, and sometimes a little bit overly complex, granted, but they require a lot of forethought and engagement with what you're doing. You can't play autopilot to solve some of these puzzles, and they constantly are using some of the new mechanics introduced by every power-up you get. But these two things are not isolated in the game. They are not in individual bubbles. They are part of a greater whole, and together it makes the game feel very stop and start and sort of inconsistent in terms of gameplay experience. Unfortunately, it means that the combat kind of comes out of nowhere and might be a little bit too demanding and confusing, and the puzzles just sort of slow the game down to a crawl. If you prefer one type of gameplay to the other, you might end up entirely disappointed by this, and while you might enjoy both, the fact that the game doesn't really stick to an individual lane, it ends up kind of creating a lukewarm experience both on the action and puzzle side, along with just feeling in general very bizarrely paced and inconsistent. I like this game, and I think there's a lot of good going on here, but at the same time it feels like it doesn't entirely know what it wants to be, and that in turn kind of creates a bit of a middling experience overall. The presentation to Iconoclasts is beautiful. All the artwork in this game is just gorgeous. Going to new areas and just seeing the palette and the different sprites for all the environments and characters, it's just fantastic. I'm really a big fan of the big electric forest. And like I said, there's a lot of really cool background storytelling that explains, you know, the world and its history in the game as you play. So there's a lot of really great background details. The individual characters are great, and the animations for each character convey their personalities fantastically. And there's a lot of really bespoke animations and stuff that don't get used too often, which ultimately means that there's very clearly a lot of effort put in here, and it shows. Audio-wise, the soundtrack is tremendous. Pretty much every time I went to a new area, I just had to stop and listen to the soundtrack for a while. The soundtrack to this game is fantastic, and the sound effects are certainly serviceable. Ultimately, the presentation to Iconoclasts is excellent across the board. Now, if you want a copy of Iconoclasts on Steam, it is typically going for about $25, although as of now, it is currently on sale for about $7.50. At $25, I'd say that's fairly expensive. I would probably recommend getting this at about half price if you want to dip your toes in. I think for the 70% off it's currently at $7.50, it's decent, certainly. The big issue that I'm really having trouble recommending this game, in spite of the fact that it has a brilliant story and it really does excel in certain places in the gameplay, is just the fact that it does come across as a bit inconsistent in terms of gameplay tone, and that it could ultimately be frustrating if you prefer one of the two gameplay styles versus the other. I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to Sly Boots for hooking me up with this. He actually sent this to me as a birthday gift as well for the show, which was pretty cool. And I was very excited to play this, and I have to admit, I had a lot of fun with it. But I will say that the sort of inconsistent pacing and the use of puzzles really did end up slowing the game down, in my opinion. I think it starts off on a really high note, and when it does embrace the action elements, it's great. When it focuses more on the puzzles, it really does slow down, and that's not quite my jam. That's the thing about this game. I think I see a lot of really good in this game. I see a good game here, but it's just very inconsistent, and unless those inconsistencies do hit well for you, it might be a very middling experience. And that's ultimately the sad thing, because it has a brilliant story, it has amazing characters, it has a fantastic environment, and like I said, when the mechanics do hit, it hits hard. The action is fantastic when it wants to be an action game. When it wants to be a puzzle game, though, it just slows to a crawl, and that doesn't really hit as hard for me. I think this is definitely going to be a your mileage may vary type of thing, but if you're interested in puzzles as well as action platforming, this game might be your jam. I'm definitely having a hard time saying I can fully recommend it at full price, though. $25 is a bit expensive, especially for a game that does end up coming across as a bit all over the place and stop and start, but it is a very beautiful game, and if it's within your budget and you do think this looks cool, you might want to give Iconoclasts a shot.